Hello and welcome to the gallery. My name is Jon. Let's paint a really old model. Now, last Saturday it was 35 years of 40K on the GW website and in their official stores and everything like that. And they had this theme going about painting a really old model or a new model in an old fashion or whatever, just celebrate the 35 years of Warhammer 40K. And of course, I being a sheep and following the flock, I decided to take part in this. So I went looking through my boxes of old stuff, and I found Ogryn from, I think, the mid-90s or something like that. So I decided to strip the little bit of paint that he had on him, it was just a little bit on his face or something like that, and paint him up to the sort of best of my ability in a quick-ish enough fashion. I'm not going to explain every little bit that I'm doing here. The paints will be coming up, of course, but I will be mixing and matching while I'm painting on the wet palette, adding here, subtracting there, mixing the colors up a little bit, just to get some interesting flow going on it. So let's just dive into it and see how he turns out. Now let's start with the skin of the Ogryn. Now this is a very old model, it's a metallic model, so it's a little bit rough around the edges. I have a black primer with zenithal skeleton bone on top of it, but then we will be painting on top of that. This is mainly just so it's easier for me to look at where the lines are and the shadows and everything like that. And as you can see, I try to keep my brush a little bit moist throughout the process. It helps the paint flow from the brush. We're starting out with just dryad bark, and this is fairly thin, as you can see, and I'm putting down many layers to get a smoother tone. A little bit later on we'll be adding a little bit of flayed one flesh into the dryad bark, and always a little bit more and a little bit more till we get to almost just pure flayed one flesh and we get sort of a smooth look going. Now we're not going for super crisp, awesomely blended smooth. Then you would need a lot more layers, a lot more glazing, a lot more work on it. This is just a quick but still looking kind of nice look. As you can see, we're starting to put a little bit of a lighter color down now, and I'm keeping the shadow still dark. Now this dries a little bit more translucent than it's going on, so it will be a little bit smoother, like I said, but still on the rougher side. If we want to go for a really competition piece on this, you could spend weeks on it, weeks that I don't have at the moment. Now for the face, I'm being a little bit more focused because it's of course quite the focal point. I'm really highlighting the top of the nose and the cheekbones and the eyebrows. Of course a little bit on the chin, but we will work on the beard there later. As you can see, the bridge of the nose, the tip of the nose, the cheekbones, the eyes, the eyelids, this is everything that you have to focus on. And it was really fun to paint this model because it's a lot burlier than your regular models, but it still has the same, well, similar physique, and therefore it's fun to paint and a little bit easier on the fingers than with the smaller minis. And now we have a little bit more flayed one flesh into the paint, and we're continuing on with the highlights, layer after layer. Sometimes I'm using the same color I was using before, just putting a little bit more of it because it's not really that opaque, and just a dab here, a dab there, following the ridge of the nose. We want highlights, we're not putting down a layer that is just completely covering. We're working the shadows and working the highlights, finding our middle ground. After I felt that I was there with the tonal value of the skin, I started putting a little bit of different tones to it. It was a little bit flat, even though it was structurally with contrast, but it was still just those two colors mixing together. So some Reichland flesh shade, just here and there, fairly thinned out. I have it on my wet palette, and I'm just focusing it a little bit. The highlights can be the original flayed one flesh color, but we want some tones to the skin, make it feel a little bit more alive. So I'm going into the recesses, into the shadows, here and there on the skin, a little bit of blotches here and there, just to give him the feeling of it having some tonal value, because your skin is just not this one color. It's a little bit more interesting than that. And being a big burly guy, his skin may be strained a little bit here and there. So a little bit of caribou crimson, again fairly thinned out, on his nose, between the biggest parts of his muscles, where the thing is on his face, over the eye, everything where the skin might be strained, just that tiny minuscule amount, give it a little bit of red glow. And of course he has a beard, well, a stubble, and a little bit of a 5 o'clock shadow on the top of his head. So I'm just taking Nuln Oil, again fairly thin down, and just glazing that over those bits, just to get that hint of a stubble. And you can see this is an old model, so stubble and stubble of the hair is obviously shown with just shade and dots into the head. Next we're going for detail, so bring out the glasses. I'm painting the teeth in bone white, and then while I'm doing that I will also go into the eyes a little bit later on. Bone white over all the teeth, being careful not to hit that skin we've been working on, and these glasses really do help, even though they're quite uncomfortable on the bridge of the nose. But hey, every little counts. And of course he has this lovely little band-aid on his shoulder. It's a lovely touch. It's almost selling me just on the model, just this little band-aid. We're just using bone white again for that, because why not? He's got dirty teeth. Why not a similar looking dirty band-aid on his shoulder? And after that has dried, we're just going with Agrax Earthshade. Again, everything is coming from the wet palette, so it's all automatically a little bit thinned out, even the shades. And Agrax Earthshade, again, also on the band-aid, but as you can see, I'm focusing it a little bit on the middle part. I'm trying to get a more natural look going to the model. It's not just shade slapped on top of everything, and then you do what you will. We're focusing what we're doing, and where we'd feel like it might be a little bit lighter than it actually is after the shade, we're going back in with bone white and highlighting the teeth and also the band-aid a little bit. Getting a little bit of crisp highlight here and there really does sell the depth of the model, even where it is lacking in depth, because some of these details on this guy are fairly just clumped together. It's an old metallic model, then of course you're going to have to deal with that. Now for the eye, I'm just using matte white, thinned out of course, because it's quite a chunky paint from Army Painter, and then matte black for the actual iris. We're not going overly complex or anything like that. I'm not painting his blue eyes or something like that. And then I took a little bit of matte black and I ran it under the eye, because the white went a little bit haywire, and also it felt like it needed a little bit more contrast. And now the face is somewhat complete, and I dig it. Now it's time to start looking at his clothes, and we're going for a fairly natural look to most of it. So let's start out with the most natural of it all, a little bit of a green west, and I'm using Castellan green, and we'll be mixing in a little bit of orc flesh in progressively thicker distributions. We start with just Castellan green, then a little bit of orc flesh, then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, always working up a little bit tighter, getting some highlight going. As you can see, the first layer of the orc flesh mixed into Castellan green is quite a big highlight, but we're always doing a little bit thinner and a little bit thinner, keeping the palette wet and the paints moist and just mixing it as we go. Finally, we're using a little bit of Nurgling green, just getting some adds highlights here and there, focusing on the bottom, focusing on the tears around the bigger folds of the fabric, around the stitching, making a little bit of mark here and there, making it look a little bit rugged and alive. And this really does sell it quite a lot to give it a nice warm highlight like this. I felt it was a little bit flat, so I grabbed some Athonian camo shade, threw that on the wet palette, and I started shading into the bigger folds and around all the stitching of the vest. Now for the pants later on, we're going to do the same thing. Then we're going to use the main shade color we're using, and we're going to put that around all the stitching, and then following that up with bone white. We're going to do that also for the pants and all the stitching on them. It's just bone white over the shade color of the fabric piece that we're working on at any given point. And it gives it a crisp sort of stitching look, and that's enough. Now, I wanted him to wear these dark blue jeans because why not? He looks like he's an everyday Joe. He likes his coffee. He likes to go to work. So I'm starting out with Cantor Blue, which is a fairly bright blue color. And maybe one day when he started wearing these pants, they were this bright blue colors, but they've seen some things during his lifetime, like most likely he has as well. So we're starting with Cantor Blue, just filling out the pants, and this is the only part of the guy that I'm really just hamming down the shade. I'm using some blue shade, Dragon of Night shade, yes, and I'm just brushing that over the entirety of the pants. Now this is still quite thick of a shade, but I'm taking it from a wet palette, so it's always a little bit lighter than it would be straight from the pot. And of course the model is quite heavy, so we started to fall from the blue tad. Now I'm starting to highlight him again, and I'm using Cantor Blue again, but the bone white that we've been using from the wet palette, I mixed that into Cantor Blue to make it a little bit of a lighter blue, to give it a little bit of a lighter highlight without losing any tonal value. If I would put white into the blue, it would just become this really strangely white bluish color. It still has a little bit of warmth because I have this yellowy bone color in the blue. Now for all the leathers and the wooden stock on his gun, I'm using Dryad Bark again because it's on the palette. I'm using what I have in front of me, see if I can use it or have to find something else. Now all the leather bits are just base coat with Dryad Bark, and it's really a simple process because I'm not doing it overcomplicated when you can do it in a fun way but a simple way. So it's all the ammo belts and everything like that, and then null oil over top of that. It's a fairly thin null oil that I have because I've thinned it out a little bit through the years. This pot of it, I have a fair few pots of null oil at this point. So this is not from the wet palette, but from this thinned out pot I have, which is just the hint of a black shade. And I'm going over the ammo belts and over the stock and the handle of the gun and everything like that. Just so we get the shades started, we start working on a little bit of highlights to the shade. Dryad Bark again, finding all the recesses, leaving the recesses alone and finding all the raised bits of both the boots and the belt and everything, just to get this nice little rugged leather look going. For the ammo belt, it was quite easy, just brushing over the frontmost part of all these bits, and you're almost done. Well, I'm still using a little bit of the bone white that I have on the palette. I like that color, and having the same color for most of the highlights and mixing it into the other colors kind of ties everything together. So this is a bone white mixed quite heavily into the Dryad Bark, and we just brush that on top of the biggest creases, and you get this nice, crisp, interesting looking highlight. It's a little bit on the rugged side, but this is the leather and it can be a little bit rugged. Now for all the tassels, I went really lazy. Just Gryph-hound orange, and then I highlighted the bits that stuck out the most with demonic yellow. I know this is lazy, but these are 2-3 tassels, and having them just really strikingly different from the rest of the guy kind of is a cool look. It draws the eye without drawing it too much. Now we have to start looking at the metallics, and they are fairly simple on this guy. It's a rudimentary guy, so I went a rudimentary route. I started with a plate mail metal from Army Painter. I like this color for when I want it looking a little bit rough. It's a little bit of a rougher silver color. It's not as smooth as the Vallejo silver or Runefang steel or something like that. It's just a little bit grainy, and I like it. It makes it look like a little bit of an older metal. So that's over all the bolts. Bolts, yeah, these aren't really bullets on his casing, his knife, the toes on his workman's boots, and all these little plates here and there. But then I want to have a little bit of a variant to the metallic colors, not just silver everywhere or steel or whatever like that. I want to have a little bit of gold here and there, so a few of those extra little metallic plates on his pants and all the skull jewelry, a little bit on the sword, a little bit on the gun, a little bit on the metallic bits around his face. Let's put some gold there just to break up the monotony of metals here. And after I put down a little bit of gold, I felt necessary to break it up a little bit more. So I got this Warplock bronze, and I started doing a little bit of dots just here and there, not too much. A little bit on the guard of the little army knife that he has there. Well, I say a little, it's bigger than most of the models I have. And a little bit here and there, just to have some extra look to it. Now, over all the metallic bits, I am washing quite heavily with appreiciated, and as you can see, this is straight from the pot. This is nothing done on the wet palette. I want the metallics to look old and grimy, but I want to focus it a little bit, like on the blade. I have to drag it out a little bit so it looks a little bit nicer. It's not just blotchy. Over every metallic bit now, I'm dry brushing Necron compound. It'll tie everything much more together, so the bronze and the silver and the gold all share this similar highlight, and it gives it a nice look. It's a little bit maybe monotonous, but the look is still valid. Now, I forgot to show you how I did the part on the gun, where I went with first Dragon of Nightshade and then Null Oil to make it a little bit more burnt, and Flesh Tears Red on the islands. And here is the Ogryn from 1990, something and a bit. It's maybe not the crispest of paint jobs, but I like it. It has this retro feel, and even though the look is maybe not really a retro paint job, I like how he looks, and having stared at his metallic skin for almost decades, it's nice to see some sort of color on him. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me here today. There are links in the description for all kinds of stuff, social media and various tidbits. You do with it what you will. Like, share and subscribe, and let the colors flow. But until next time, farewell.